Hello and welcome to another edition of Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks, and our guest this week is truly a Renaissance man, especially in the fields of marketing and entertainment. Toronto-based but widely traveled Barry Avrich, who has more than 60 credits as a producer, director, and writer of films and documentaries, an author of 3 books, and a marketing guru who's advised some of the biggest companies and most prestigious arts organizations in North America. As the old saying goes, Barry's contact list is as long as your driveway. Barry Avrich, thank you for joining us on Canada Files.
My pleasure.
You know, we'll get into specifics in a moment, but in the intro that I just did, I've described you as somewhat of a Renaissance man in the areas of marketing and entertainment. And when I look over the list, I mean, you've been a writer, a producer, a director, a creative advertiser, a promoter, a stage manager, and a philanthropist, among many other labels, I'm sure, that have been pinned on you. But let me ask you, when you meet somebody for the first time at a reception or a cocktail party or something, and they say, "And Barry, what do you do?" What do you answer?
I don't talk to people anymore. I don't feel that I have to, Jim, on that end of it. So generally, if I see people making their way over to me, I just tend to go to the bar. No, I mean, I've led this hybrid life of being in advertising in the film business my entire career, and many people still say, "Well, you have to choose." Well, why? You know, I can be creative in 30 seconds, and I can be creative in 90 minutes, or whatever it is that I'm working on. We just got finished filming 3 Tall Women, doing the post-production on 3 Tall Women, Martha Henry's last performance, which we're going to release this fall.
Great Canadian actress.
Spectacular. Yeah. And, legendary. American, came to Canada and performed in some of the greatest Stratford roles ever, Long Day's Journey, The Tempest, first female Prospero, I think, on that end of it. And so, there's been so many career highlights in both careers that, I never really want to choose.
So when you first started out, after you left university, did you want or expect all those various labels to ultimately be applied to yourself? Or did you just have one singular ambition at the start?
I just wanted to tell stories. When I first got out of university, and I had, many people telling me, "You're just not going to find a career in entertainment in this country. You have the National Film Board making films about the gestation period of the beaver, and and other television 1- 2 camera shows on CBC. You have to get out and get to the United States. You're just not going to succeed here in this country." Well, that wasn't an option for me. I didn't have any money. I certainly didn't have any connections then in Los Angeles or New York. So I just had to find my path, and then started making short films. Got a job at an ad agency. Started producing and directing TV commercials with no experience on that end of it. People would say, "Here's the commercial that we need." I didn't even know what they were talking about. I mean, my first job in advertising was working for Ed Mirvish and the famous Royal Alexandra Theatre in Toronto, and they said, I got a phone call, my boss was away, and it was the legendary impresario Gino Empri who handled publicity for the theatre, and he called me on behalf of Ed Mirvish and screamed and yelled at where my boss was, and he said, "Look, a chorus line is coming to town at the Royal Alex. It's going to be here in July, and I need a radio buy, and I need to see it on my desk immediately." Well, I didn't know what a radio buy was. I knew a chorus line was one of the first musicals I'd seen, and literally had to call up somebody at a radio station and say, "What's a radio buy, and what does he mean by 30 seconds?" So I learned very quickly and became addicted. I was addicted at the age of 8, but just to be here in Toronto and work on great theater, and then Les Mis, and then, and then of course the Garth Drabinsky years of Live End, and then simultaneously, going on to make, close to 60 films. It's been a hell of a ride.
Take us back to the age of 8, when you said you were already addicted to entertainment. What got your interest in entertainment? I mean, most kids growing up in Montreal back in the 60s, I guess, wanted to be hockey players. What was the lure of entertainment for you?
The hockey players on my street that played hockey said, "Look, why don't you try entertainment?" That was it. That sports and me were just never going to be anything that worked well together. My father loved show business. He wasn't in the business, and took me at the age of 8 or 9 to audition for what they called a minstrel show at the local theater in town, being produced by an old vaudeville producer named Sam Miller, whose son Joey Miller went on to become a fairly well-known composer. And he brought me in to audition for him. I had to learn a song. They heard me sing. I joke about this all the time. I had to learn, what the world needs now. My mother helped me read the music and learn the song. I went in, I sang one note, and Sam Miller, the producer and director of the show, said, "We're going to do comedy." And I became the comedy host over 3 weekends of this variety show. And I loved it. My father sent me fake telegrams from The Tonight Show and other network shows saying, we're giving you a 3-year contract. I loved it. But I didn't have a plan, but it was just, all right, Toronto's the next place, and then let me figure out a way to somehow make this, crazy life work.
You mentioned your father, who clearly had an influence on you as a young boy. And on your personal website, you actually refer to some advice that your dad gave you when you were a young man. And I will quote, "I don't care what you do with your life, but make sure you never blend in."
Right.
Has that been a mantra for you all your life? And for that matter, what is so wrong with blending in anyway?
There's nothing wrong with blending in for, most people. But I think that as Canadians, you have to figure out how to come in and own the room. I do. You don't have to, but that was a choice I made because we have this stigma as Canadians, especially in the entertainment industry, of never being accepted. I've had this conversation with everybody from Jim Carrey to Catherine O'Hara to some of the greats in the industry. Why did they leave? They just never felt accepted in their own country. I still feel that, and I stayed.
We'll talk about you staying a little bit later, but I want to now skip forward. After about 15 years in marketing and advertising, I mean, you stayed in that business, yes, but you now started to devote more of your time to documentary filmmaking. And one of the first productions that you did was on Lew Wasserman, who had died about 3 years before. This is the early 2000s now, but he had been the notoriously private and ultra-powerful boss of MCA Universal. Even though he had died, it was still pretty courageous of you to take him on as a documentary subject. What was it about Lew Wasserman that fascinated you?
So the film was called The LastMogul, 2005. I had made about 3 documentaries prior to that and then wanted a big entree card into Hollywood. How can I make a film that wasn't Canadian, that had Canadian connections, but that ultimately announced that I was going to be a documentary filmmaker in the United States? How do I figure that out? So Lew Wasserman, most powerful man in Hollywood, I had seen him at a party about a year and a half before he died and said, "I'm going to make a film about you." And he pushed his thumb into my neck and said, "Not while I'm alive and not while I'm dead." And people said, "You'll never get it made, you'll never get it done." The New York Times, said, hand from the grave, because while making the film, I was threatened by his family. I was followed. We were changing hotel rooms to move the footage that we were shooting on that, because Lew was still powerful. His family was still powerful, mob connections, all that stuff. But I wanted to make it, A, because people said it wouldn't be done, and that his story, from a poor guy from Cleveland, redefining an industry, redefining the way Hollywood contracts were negotiated, how studio deals were made, syndication, television, the movie of the week, on and on and on. I mean, he was it. And so off I went.
And it was a very successful production.
Yeah. It got me attention. Was a calling card to say, if I were going in and say, okay, he made The LastMogul.
Well, talking about difficult subjects, just a few years after that, you took on a documentary about Harvey Weinstein, and this was at a time, about 2008, 2009, when Harvey was at the height of his personal power in Hollywood. You could easily have had your knees broken trying to get that documentary off the ground, but you did it. How did you do it?
Well, I did have my knees broken.
I'm not surprised.
And I'm thankfully, through a lot of therapy, I'm here to tell the story. Harvey Weinstein, at that time, when I made that film, it was called Unauthorized. He was actually, at the time of his career where his power was fading, which I think gave me the entree where he just couldn't really block it. He does end up getting the card, the trump card, I hate to use that word, but he does end up diffusing the film to a certain degree. But I basically, as I do, because I'm a marketing PR guy, I announced to the New York Times that I was going to make the film, and then the war began. You know, you can't make it yet. I haven't been in Act 3 yet. You got to wait, but it was too late. I announced I was making it. I had raised the money to make it, and you know, he threatened me. We ended up having one of these great mafia-like meetings in Los Angeles the night before the Oscars, where he would be almost his huge comeback with the King's Speech. We had this huge meeting in LA, and he said, and he kept pitching ideas for other films. And I said, Harvey, I'm done. I'm done. We've made it. How about this? How about that? How about this? How about that? I said, no, I'm going to make it. I'm going to make the film. And he goes, well, you know, one day I'm going to show up at your house with a camera crew, and you'll see how you like it. I said, well, then sit down and do an interview with me. You know, what are you going to lose? You've done your due diligence on me. You know, you've seen the other films I've made. You saw The Last Mogul. But he wouldn't hear of it. So here's what he did, Jim, which was interesting. We make the film during the Toronto Film Festival. He had a major network in the United States, IFC Films, make me an offer I couldn't refuse, literally, speaking of The Godfather, and offered me more money for a documentary than I'd ever seen before. And I should have known. You know, we signed the agreement on the hood of a car in Toronto somewhere on that end of it, and we had a big party, and it was exciting. And then I got called to New York to meet with IFC, the head of IFC at the time, and he had a large legal pad, yellow legal pad, with changes that he wanted to the film. And I said, sounds to me like you've conferred with Harvey on this. Well, we have. You know, Harvey's best friend owns the IFC, James Dolan. I said, well, I'm sorry. You know, I'm happy to give you the money back. My lawyers were, what do you mean give the money back? Are you crazy? I said, well, this is ridiculous. So we would compromise. I can't tell you on air because of your esteemed audience in these airwaves of what things I had to, what they gave in on. I felt I got the upper hand. However, they would air the film at times of the morning where, you know, you would see infomercials for St. Bernards that are in desperate need of homes or things like that. You never saw the film. So he won. He
won at that point,
yes.
But about 6 or 7 years later, you did a subsequent documentary
yes.
on Harvey Weinstein. This is after his world had begun to fall.
Months after.
Begun to fall apart.
Months after.
Because of all the women that came forward accusing him of rape and harassment. Did you know about this aspect of his life when you did the first one? And if you did, how did you not put it into the first one?
It's a great question. I mean, one of the reasons why I ended up making The Reckoning.
Which is the second one.
Correct, for CBC in Canada and on Hulu in the United States, was that my conscience bothered me. So this film, Unauthorized, whether people had seen it or not, was hardly a fluff piece on Harvey, but it was laudatory in terms of his career on that end of it. But it bothered me that that was going to be the only record attached to my name on Harvey versus all of the allegations that were proven to be true later on. And I knew I had to come back. So The Reckoning, yes, is very much Harvey, but it also looked at the entire industry. So back to your question of what did I know, there were a ton of rumors circulating around Harvey when I made my film, tons of them. And what would happen is, he's still powerful, don't forget. I would bring it up with the people that would sit before me, and they would go, can you turn the camera off? And none of them would go on record, none of them. So, you know, what can I literally say? I talked about his temper. You know, the great George Hickenlooper, director who ended up dying, talked about Harvey's obsession, sexual obsessions, and talked about how Harvey would insist on directing sex scenes. And so you see a certain side of him in that way. But, you know, I couldn't blow the lid off of anything. I mean, a bunch of reporters had the story too in that. You know, this was 6 years earlier. And nobody can go there. I mean, you know, threatened by his lawyers. I mean, he sent a publicist to sit in on one of the interviews. People were canceling while, you know, making the first film because of that. James Ivory, Merchant Ivory,
yes.
Great Merchant Ivory, you know, Howard Zen called me from a subway when we were making the first film, Unauthorized. Said, Barry, I just can't do it. Nobody else is buying my films in Hollywood other than Harvey. I can't do it. And I said, Jim, I've set up, you know what it is to set up a whole crew. Give me a break. All right, fine. And he came and he was great. But I couldn't deliver the goods in the first film. Bothered me. on that end of it. So The Reckoning was the answer to that. And I will tell you, Jim, that The Reckoning was not an easy road for me. I was the first documentary out that looked at the Me Too movement, and nobody wanted it. And here's what would happen. I'd go to studios with it, or my team would, and they'd say, you're turning a mirror around to us and showing what we look like. And then I would get an offer from a famous streamer, and the offer would come in, and then they would have their own allegations of Me Too. A week later, they go, we can't take the film. Hulu was the bravest one who finally took it, but it was too early. It was too early for people to really, and nobody really wants to watch these kind of films. I had the same situation where many years before Jeffrey Epstein, many years before he killed himself or anybody knew who he was, I knew the story and was trying to get a documentary pitched, or I was pitching a documentary on him. I had the inside on so much stuff, couldn't sell it. No one knew of him. They couldn't care less. He wasn't arrested the second time yet. And, and even the series that ultimately was done, nobody really liked watching.
Well, you have done other controversial figures, maybe not as controversial in the Me Too movement area, but you've done people like the fallen Canadian theater impresario Garth Drabinsky, with whom you were quite close.
Yes.
You've done the late publisher of Penthouse magazine, but you've also done some non-controversial people in your documentaries. The Nuremberg prosecutor, Jack Ferenz, wonderful, Ben Ferenz.
Yeah.
Comedians Howie Mandel and David Steinberg, also Canadian. Music producer David Foster, Canadian. Rock concert promoter Michael Cole. So you've done both sides of the fence, as it were, with prominent and successful people and prominent and perhaps more questionable people. Who are the ones along the way that have fascinated or inspired you most?
All of them. I mean, I don't really make films by commission. I pick films that interest me in terms of people that, I think stories that should be told, always with, 10 ounces of what's commercial. I want, people to see it. If they're going to make something about somebody that nobody's ever heard of, in Ben Ferenz's case, I mean, he'd been on 60 Minutes. I was shocked there wasn't a documentary, at 100 years old, and I had to make it. But it's always somebody I either want to meet. Now I'm working with this extraordinarily talented producer, Mark Selby, and we spend countless hours a day putting together our wish lists and our dream lists and laughing and joking about who we want to make films on. And I always say to him, don't threaten me. I think there isn't a project that I've wanted to make that hasn't gotten made. We find a way to do it. One of your most recent documentaries, as you mentioned, is Oscar Peterson, who was the great Canadian jazz pianist. Your documentary covered his life and his impact. He was a god in the world of jazz, but not all that widely known outside that world. What fascinated you so much about Oscar? I mean, Mark Selby, who I referred to earlier, my producer, we're sitting around thinking about subject matters on that end of it. And Mark is such a talented musician. He plays piano like the gods. I don't. I always wanted to play piano. And we were just sitting around, and and I always come back to that basement in Montreal, to that teak cabinet in that horrible wood faux paneled basement. Think about the albums that I would go to, that I would escape to, that my parents had, Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald and some comedian albums, and certainly Oscar Peterson was one of them. And and one of us sort of blurted out the idea of Oscar Peterson, went to check immediately, has there been a documentary, what's out there on him, and then pitched it to the network in Canada, and now it's on Hulu in the United States, and off we went. I'm a big proponent of telling stories of Canadians, because again, we're just not good at telling our own stories. Shows like this, thank God they exist, but we're just not great at it. And if there's a Mount Rushmore of jazz, I always say, then Oscar should be on it. I think one of the reasons why he's not widely known, when you think jazz, you think of the greats, and Oscar's one of them. I think one of the reasons why is that he decided to stay in Canada. It's not unlike Norman Jewison, one of the great film directors of all time. I mean, when you're thinking about great directors and you're having that conversation in Los Angeles or New York, the name doesn't come up as often as it should. Same with Oscar. But he decided to make Canada his home. So you live with that. I described
you in the intro as well by saying that you have a contact list or a Rolodex that's as long as your driveway. And you've actually described a lot of the people that you've known and worked with and bumped into over the years in your book. Moguls, monsters, and madmen, they're not all following into those categories. But I'm wondering, of all the people that you've known and worked with over the years, who are some of the people who have inspired you along the way?
Two of the greats for me, Tony Bennett and Quincy Jones, without a doubt. Quincy in that he's just a great listener, and he would spend tons of time with me. And there was one particular time I was going through a very difficult time in my life, you know, and he just literally held my hands in his house in Los Angeles, and he said, "Don't you understand that every beautiful picture starts with a negative?" Wow.
What an interesting thought.
Yeah. So I mean that, you know, and I wept a little, and then, you know, with Quincy, breakfast is at, you know, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I learned early on that you never make plans because you're just going to spend the next 14 hours with him, and so great life lessons. And Tony Bennett is somebody that I just respect in terms of how he looked after his instrument, his voice, his elegance, and again, another great listener, and just a sensational showman. And I've seen, you know, from Sinatra, everybody, Celine, everybody. I've had these great opportunities to meet all these people, and, you know, and Tony is fantastic. I mean, Celine Dion's another one who, you know, people have their own perceptions of her. Could she really be that nice? 100%. I started with her, brought her to Toronto to do a job with American Express in 1991 as Beauty and the Beast was coming out, somewhere in that time, and I couldn't have met a more humble person that cared about what was going on in my life as it did in hers. And then fast forward to the David Foster documentary, where, you know, she was just equally as fabulous and caring. She was in this bone broth phase at that time. She would say to me, "Barry," and I won't do the accent, "you're eating too much red licorice and you have to switch to bone broth," and she'd have this bone broth. I mean, fabulous, and a great career and giving. And so, you know, back to Quincy for a minute. Also, you know, he instilled this sense of what the alchemy of life is, you know, which was live, love, laugh, and give back. And he said, let's start with each word and talk about that for a minute. And it sounds cliche and hackney, but you spend time with him dissecting those words, and you say, okay, he's seen it all, he's done it all, then, you know, he's worth listening to.
On the subject of giving back, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about some of the, or maybe just one, of the philanthropic projects that you've been involved with over the last 25 or 30 years. What are some or one of those projects that really stand out for you that you're most proud of?
I think, look, you know, as part of the Quincy Give Back thing, and it's not like, you know, I have the means to be as philanthropic as I'd like to be. However, you know, philanthropy could be, you know, I sponsored somebody in a marathon run in Los Angeles today for a little bit of money, but it just every nickel adds up. And I learned that working with the Canadian Opera Company, where somebody called in to make a donation for $5, and they were taught, and we were all taught at that point, that $5 could end up becoming $500,000, which it did with that one caller. They offered that one caller on the phone a tour of the new Four Seasons Center in Toronto, Canadian Opera House, a tour, and she came down and was so blown away that she ended up making her donation $500,000. So big difference. So for me, I mean, the two things that stand out in terms of philanthropy is creating a program for young filmmakers at the Toronto Film Festival in my father's name, which gave young filmmakers an opportunity to attend the film festival and get all their industry passes and everything looked after. Did that for 10 years. My father would have loved that. And then I followed up with supporting a new initiative in the film festival last year for black filmmakers to, you know, to get their films marketed and exposed during the film festival as well. And then I think the major one, Jim, was the establishing the Daniels Hollywood Theater at the Toronto Sick Kids Hospital. It's the first movie theater in a hospital that showed first-run films for patients, children in the hospital. And Jeff Katzenberg and Ellis Jacob from Cineplex in Canada were there from the beginning when we launched that. And we just secured a major gift to rebuild it when the new building goes up in Toronto by the same donors, the Daniels family, Myrna and John Daniels, and I'm very proud of that. To be there that opening day and watch children come down that could not leave that building, some of them that never have left that building, to see, I think it was Shrek 2 or something, open up on that end of it was just spectacular for me.
Last question, one I ask all guests on Canada Files, but it'll be a very interesting answer from you. What does being Canadian mean to you?
Being Canadian to me means opportunity, insecurity complex, freedom, and being extraordinarily distinctive and creative.
You're the first guest that's ever said insecurity complex, but I think it's a very valid point about all of us. We're very proud of ourselves, but at the same time, we don't like to really talk about ourselves.
Well, what you don't know, Jim, is that I have another film crew here that is filming all of this. We're going to re-edit this entire segment, and I'll send it to you. And everything changed about me that it looks just way better and re-edited. So you'll get the whole segment in the next couple of days.
No insecurity there, but
yeah.
Listen, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime, Jim.
And thank you for joining us on Canada Files. We'll see you again with the next episode.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Francis and Eleanor Shen, as well as the following donors: Akito Investments Inc., the Browning Watt Foundation, Mary Davey, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, Michael and Mary Ellen Hogan, Ted and Alice Kernahan, David and Cheryl Carr, Philip B. Lind, the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, the North Pine Foundation, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.